Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CG as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CG. I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the Signature Lecture Series. Thanks also to those joining us from around the world through our live webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience, the live audience here at the microphones on either side, or if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the chat function on your screen, and those will be transmitted to our speaker here. Please remember to state your name at that time and keep your questions brief. Now, anyone who's taken a boat out on even the calmest waters knows the difference between rowing and steering. Steering brings to mind words such as vision, direction, and stability. And this metaphor is one of the metaphors used in the Oxford Martin Commission report for future generations. It's called Now for the Long Term. The Oxford Martin School established this commission to consider how governments and global institutions can look beyond the pressures of short-term crises and plan for the long term. Our guest this evening will explain the importance of the commission's work and the need for governments to do less rowing and more steering, with more of an eye on the distant horizon. Natalie Day is Head of Policy at the Oxford Martin School and led the Commission's Secretariat. She's responsible for establishing it as a leading source of policy-relevant research on global challenges and opportunities. Natalie was previously a senior researcher at the UK think tank Demos, specializing in global innovation policy. In a recent column in The Guardian, Natalie described the Commission's report as the beginning of a conversation to shift perspectives towards the longer term. We're pleased that Natalie has chosen to further that conversation with a public audience here at CG in Waterloo. So please join me now in welcoming our distinguished guest, Natalie Day.
Great. Thank you, Fred, for that very kind introduction, and it's great to be here in Waterloo to talk to you tonight about the Now for the Long Term, the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations. Unfortunately, we did have a bit of a hiccup with the delivery of the reports today, which we did hope to be able to disseminate, but unfortunately, perhaps due to weather and some other DHL complications that we could be the subject of a whole other lecture. We don't actually have the reports this evening, but they will be available here at CG, I'm told, and you can also download the report from the Oxford Martin School website, which will provide the website. Hopefully this talk will inspire you to go and download the report, and perhaps it'll be a test of how interested you are in the report, those of you that come back to actually physically get it. And I'll also be looking at the download figures from Waterloo post this to see how many of you have followed up. So sorry that the report is not here. But firstly, I wanted to give you a bit of background of the Oxford Martin School, which is obviously where we decided to establish the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations. We were set up by this guy, James Martin, who very generously gave $100 million to Oxford University, and then another $50 million if it could be matched to set up the Oxford Martin School. And essentially we fund interdisciplinary research into 21st century global challenges. And we now fund over 35 different programs and institutions across the university that are all doing interdisciplinary research on longer term issues. And to be funded by us, it has to be interdisciplinary, you have to be in Oxford, you have to be working on a challenge of a global dimension of a longer term nature, and you have to have an impact beyond academia, which is why my role as head of policy is so important in terms of trying to connect the academic research to governments and policymakers. So much of what, it's a delight to be here today to talk about the work of the Commission. Much of it was inspired by the research that's happening at the Oxford Martin School. And our research there ranges from all the sort of nasty challenges that are out there, but also some opportunities in terms of, ageing population and economic growth and so on. But we also fund things like geoengineering and food security, ethics in war, future of humanity, all sorts of things. So if you've got some burning questions about any sort of 21st century challenges, you might also want to look into them to the Martin School. But when we were looking across these 35 programs and institutions, we wanted to sort of think about what was it that connected geoengineering to food security, to our climate program, to our ageing population program. What were some of the unifying issues that all of these different research groups in Oxford were facing? And we ultimately decided that it was an increasing concern amongst our academics about increasing short-termism within governments and policymakers, that it was increasingly difficult to get leading figures to think beyond the electoral cycle, and also a frustration with what was perceived to be a growing gridlock in many of these challenges where action is so important. And we actually know quite a lot about many of the big issues that we're facing today, and yet being able to bridge this gap between knowledge and action we found increasingly hard. So in order to try and provide some fresh thinking on these sort of critical questions, we set up the Oxford Martin Commission, and who better to lead this, we thought, than Pascal Lamy, who himself was clearly dealing with a little bit of gridlock in him trying to get through the Doha trade round at the WTO. And so when we approached Pascal to see if he would join us to lead or chair this commission, we were very delighted that he jumped on the opportunity, because for those that sort of follow Pascal's work, he's one of the sort of great intellectual thinkers on global governance reform and many of these issues, and was very, very passionate about how we might be able to provide some fresh ideas to break the gridlock on global challenges. And so with Pascal's assistance, we pulled together this list of commissioners, this sort of dauntingly impressive list of great and good that came from all over the world, and all of them with significant experience and expertise in leading governments or global governance organisations or businesses, and all of them, it's a very global commission. So we had Minister Liu He, a very senior minister in China, Nandan Nilekani, who's a minister in India who's responsible for the unique identification project there, also representatives from Brazil and Singapore, sadly no Canadians, but I'm sure in the next commission we'll be sure to address that. There's also no Australians either, so we're all in the dark here. But so this was a sort of group of people that all came together and all agreed that this was something that they wanted to try and provide some fresh thinking on. And my own role, I mean, behind every great and good commission, there's obviously a great and good secretariat. We were just a small secretariat, which I was very honoured to lead. And so we worked very closely with Pascal and these commissioners over just 12 months to produce the elusive report that you haven't got in front of you. So the Commission's aims, as Fred mentioned, I mean, we tried to outline an agenda for the long term, and we wanted to draw attention to this increasing short-termism of modern politics and our collective inability to break this gridlock that undermines efforts to address, the biggest challenges of today. And, we have really been overwhelmed by the response to the report. I mean, we've had over 780,000 downloads in 160 countries, which is quite, impressive number, we think, after just launching the report in October last year. And tonight, I'm just going to talk you through the Commission report in three parts of the Commission's work, and then we can, as Fred said, have some more time for questions and answers. But our case for action was really built in three parts. Part A, which Pascal often described as sort of the easy part, which was trying to capture what are these major trends and challenges that are likely to shape the next century. So what should we be thinking about? What should we be worrying about? The second part, where we hope the Commission report has genuinely added something new to these discussions and debates, because there are a lot of reports on major trends and challenges, is where we try to learn from previous examples of success and failure in addressing global challenges. What worked, what didn't work, and also what are some of the factors today that make change so difficult for decision makers and politicians and so on. And then obviously the final part is the juicy part, the recommendations, where we try to provide a combination of practical ideas to break the gridlock on some of the challenges, but also some more principle-based ideas to try and embed the longer term in decision-making structures. So I'll just talk you through some of the quick findings. I mean, here, this slide just captures the 8 megatrends, or 7 megatrends, I should say, that the report looked at. So many of these are arising from globalisation, which are reinforcing old, but also generating new sets of challenges. Around demographics in terms of large and ageing populations, around mobility in terms of urbanisation and an expanding middle class, in society around increasing inequality and unemployment, in geopolitics, in power transitions and cybersecurity challenges, in sustainability around resource insecurity, and health around the shifting burdens of disease, and technology around the sort of information and communications revolutions and what those sorts of things mean. Many of the trends that we talk about are well known, so I'm not going to sort of dwell on them in too much detail, but I thought it was perhaps useful just to share some of the trends and challenges that we'll face, that will shape the sort of next decade or more, so that you know, just to put the report in a bit more context before getting into the second and third section. In terms of demographics, as you will be well aware, we are seeing a huge shift in demographics. Over 60% of the population is likely to live in Africa and Asia by 2050. Approximately 70% of growth is likely to occur in 24 of the world's poorest countries. Population is getting older. In less than 40 years, 1 in 5 people will be over 60 years old. In terms of mobility, when you look at challenges like urbanisation in the 1950s, only 3 in 10 people lived in cities. And in 2008, the number of people living in cities is greater than rural areas for the first time. This slide shows the rise of the middle class, also another huge phenomenon that many commentators have written significantly about. And it shows the prediction of middle class populations in 2030, which is the blue circle, compared to 2009. So the extraordinary growth in middle class is both a fantastic opportunity in terms of lifting billions of people out of poverty, and that can often provide an impetus for investment in health and education. More renewable energy can often result in more political stability. But equally, the challenge of this rising middle class is that we are also seeing an increasing divide between the growing middle class and those left behind. And also the growth in consumption and income levels adds pressure to our strained resources and environment. So these are obviously huge challenges that need to be considered sooner rather than later. This slide shows the remarkable improvement in the number of people living below or on the international poverty line. And, as you can see here with the big circles, the change has been particularly significant, the decline has been particularly significant in countries like China and India. And yet the contrast between rich and poor remains particularly stark. Societies and individuals are becoming increasingly unequal. Economic growth is also not being shared inclusively, with incomes of the world's top 1.75% of earners exceeding the combined total of those of the bottom 77%. So pretty depressing numbers. And as shown in this slide, 39% of the world's wealth is held by 0.6% of its adults. And this is all happening at the same time when current employment crisis mean that a generation of workers is at risk, with almost 30 million net jobs across all ages lost during the financial crisis, which haven't yet been recovered, and young people being particularly hit. So the sort of youth employment crisis is a particular challenge that governments and business leaders and others really need to be grappling with. Geopolitics was another of the major trends and challenges that we worried about in terms of the Commission. the shift of economic power to emerging economies is certainly well documented, with China and India on track to have 35% of the world's population and 25% of its GDP by 2030. And so with China set to overtake the US as the world's biggest economy as early as 2016, few are sort of doubting the continued strength of the US, but emerging powers are certainly gaining prominence in the global stage. So it's important to be thinking about how these geopolitical shifts also require, renewed focus and attention. And in our report, we call for sort of long overdue reforms, and I'm sure you've had many discussions in this hall about 20th century global governance institutions, the need for reform so that emerging economies possess proportionate power, and the need to use merit instead of geography to determine the leaders of multilateral institutions, and ensuring that countries with diminishing stakes do not retain disproportionate power. In terms of geopolitics, obviously a commission led by Pascal Lamy would consider the issues of trade. This slide just shows the remarkable growth in world trade since the 1960s, with developing countries achieving a share of over 50% of global trade in 2012. But we would argue in the report that the vast increase in trade opportunities hasn't necessarily been matched by a commitment to updating the trade rules for the 21st century. And I think if Pascal Lamy was here now, he would be arguing about that the trade round of Doha was paralysed because of differences amongst just a few advanced and emerging economies, not because of the consensus issue. And because of a flawed but powerful belief that many countries hold that open borders hurt local economies and they increase poverty despite particularly strong evidence to the contrary. I think the other sort of major challenge of geopolitics today, which we consider in the report and we have recommendations on, is around cybersecurity. And I know that CG are doing some excellent work around internet governance and other important areas in this space. But certainly the potential for cybercrime and for cyber aggression is relatively unconstrained by judicial boundaries and is virtually unregulated at the moment. So these are major trends and challenges that we felt were important to look at. It won't be a surprise to anyone, I hope, that the Commission highlighted issues of sustainability and resources as major trends and challenges of the century. Sustainability is inherently about the long term. It requires the reconciliation of environmental, social and economic demands necessary for the sustained survival of mankind and other organisms on the planet. But above all, it means grappling with this perfect storm associated with the inseparability of food, climate, water and energy. And this sort of term, the perfect storm, was coined by Professor Sir John Beddington, who was the previous UK Chief Government Science Advisor, who's recently actually joined the Oxford Martin School. So I certainly have his permission to use his graph for today's presentation. Within this perfect storm, I'm not going to go into all of these challenges in detail, but if you look at the energy issue, just the sheer world energy consumption demand is dramatically increasing. Total energy consumption per year is almost 6 times what it was in 1950, whilst per capita use has almost doubled. And as we think about the rise of the middle class and the effect this is going to have in terms of energy demand, the numbers can be quite alarming. In terms of CO2 emissions, this graph is taken from the latest IPCC report, which is obviously showing the rise of emissions and global temperature change. One of the many concerns of the Commission in relation to the effects of climate change and environmental degradation was that it could well undo all of the enormous progress that has been made in tackling poverty, particularly because it is often poorer people and poorer countries that are less able to cope with the dramatic effects of climate change. So We had commissioners like Nick Stern, who did the very influential Stern report in the UK on the economic effects of climate change as one of our commissioners. So this was obviously a very important issue for us to cover. And then the final set of trends and challenges that we considered was in health, and I often think it's useful to follow a complicated IPCC slide with one of Gwyneth Paltrow dying of a pandemic. In today's highly mobile, interconnected and interdependent world, risks everywhere, anywhere can be threats everywhere. And with around 40 new infectious diseases discovered in the past 40 years, the concern about further pandemics is really a question of when, rather than if. Rapidly evolving viruses such as influenza, Ebola, HIV continue to thrive today, and certain infections are re-emerging because of a growing drug resistance. For example, we have some leading academics working in pandemics in our team in Oxford, and they can lead to some pretty depressing lunch discussions, but we are seeing a real resurgence of diseases such as TB, with creating new epidemics that are much harder to treat. And with growing antibiotic resistance, this is becoming a significant threat that governments and others need to be worrying about. In health, the other big issue that the Commission was particularly concerned about was around non-communicable diseases. Diseases like diabetes, cancer, heart disease, chronic lung disease and stroke were responsible for 63% or 36 million of all global deaths in 2008. And this slide shows the projected costs of NCD by income level based on economic growth forecasts. It's also NCDs, despite often perceptions, they're not just problems of the developed countries. They are increasingly a challenge within developing countries who face then the dual burden of disease in terms of chronic and non-chronic diseases. So hugely problematic. Our report, and certainly this presentation so far, is far from exclusive or comprehensive in terms of trying to capture all of the megatrends and challenges that the world faces. There are many others out there that we can't claim to have covered in our relatively short report, but we wanted to try and give a sort of flavour of the sort of future that we're looking at, the sorts of megatrends and challenges that are likely to shape the future. And then to try and offer some practical recommendations on how to tackle some of these challenges, but also build a more resilient and inclusive society to be able to sort of deal with perhaps the trends and the challenges that are yet to be identified. So the second part of the report was trying to be a little bit more upbeat. I mean, our commissioners were always determined that we didn't want this to be a real sort of doom and gloom report. And I'm conscious that this room probably needed a little bit of uplifting after the presentation on North Korea that we were listening to just prior to my address. Some very disturbing comments, some very disturbing analysis there. But in our report, we did want to say that there are a number of examples where impediments to action have been overcome. In many areas, though, you might not have ever imagined there to be such reform. If you think about gay marriage, or I used the example this afternoon of not smoking in a sort of Parisian cafe. It seemed like something that you could never take away the right of the French to smoke in their cafes if they wanted to, and yet you have seen these sorts of changes. So, we in our report tried to look at what were some of the ingredients of those successes that led to change. And obviously one of the key ones is around the power of crisis. Crisis in driving change, like the G20's actions after the financial crisis. Even the mobilisation that occurred around the Y2K bug was able to sort of generate change and action because of this crisis. And of course, in the original creation of the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions came from crisis. There's also, when you can get shared interests together, it can be a very important driver or ingredients of change. So here we have the Montreal Protocol with the ozone layer, where there were a number of shared interests around the table, and importantly in that case it was also quite clear science. It wasn't contested to much extent, and the answer was quite, they were able to work out how to deal with CFCs, and that enabled there to be success. There's also things like leadership and inclusion that help to drive change. So we thought about Jacques Delors in the creation of the European Single Market Programme, and also the Brundtland in terms of the convention, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which I mentioned previously. And then we also looked at sort of the power of goals and prizes. So if you think about the Millennium Development Goals, whilst none of these examples are wholly perfect, and there's much analysis about the MDGs and how they came about, but in terms of concisely articulating clear goals and mobilising governments and NGOs and global governance agencies around those goals, I think we would say they have been relatively successful. I think the challenge next is what happens to the SDGs, or as they're trying to develop them. And we also had people like Mo Ibrahim on our commission. And so we looked at the sort of power of prizes in terms of trying to generate awareness or push for change in particular areas. And Mo's work has been very influential in terms of in the area of global governance reform, particularly looking at governance in Africa and really drawing attention to that on that continent. Of course, there's the other end of the spectrum, otherwise we wouldn't have had the Commission in the first place. And so we tried to look at those sort of less successful examples, including things like the tragedy of the commons that has occurred in the Aral Sea, or as is occurring in terms of overfishing. Huge problems that we're yet to appropriately grapple. There's also the lack of intergenerational vision and awareness, and I think we saw that at Rio Plus 20 or the Copenhagen talks, or perhaps any of the multilateral talks of late. In things like the financial crisis, accepting the sort of positive role of the G20 in driving change in that particular issue, there was an absence of global oversight in that regard, which led to the financial crisis, and I think there'll be decades of debate about what we knew and didn't know prior to that for time to come. But the absence of a global oversight of the entire financial crisis was obviously a key ingredient. And the final sort of ingredient that we looked at in terms of failure was one of sort of vested interests. So when you look at even still in the tobacco industry or gun control or climate lobby, particularly in the United States, the sheer power of vested interests to block or stymie any progress on these really difficult issues. So then, we tried to then take a step back from all of these examples and try to think about why, what are these sort of factors that make positive change so difficult today, and how are they different from previous times? So we identified these three. So the first one on institutions, as I sort of mentioned in some of the mega trends, many of the sort of 20th century structures and institutions suffer from legitimacy, authority, and effectiveness deficits today. The pace of reform of too many global governance institutions has been painfully slow, with traditional powers being reluctant to cede power. At the same time, many emerging powers have proved unwilling to assume leadership responsibility within global governance structures that they feel doesn't adequately represent their interests. Global meetings are increasingly problematic, with entrenched positions of participants, narrowing the possibility of consensus, while the increased number of participants has resulted in heightened fragmentation. I mean, this slide shows the extraordinary growth in the number of participants at the Rio Earth Summits, comparing 1992 to 2012. And whilst greater inclusivity is perhaps to be welcomed, the presence of so many more participants representing such diverse interests makes one question whether these international summits have perhaps become a little bit unwieldy and really unworkable, particularly for the scale of challenges that they're trying to consider. The second the second sort of shaping factor was this embedded short-termism, which sort of directs political and business cycles. And whilst it's very, it's perhaps debatable whether there's more short-termism now in politics than there was, say, 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, it is, we would argue, a huge problem, and it's only exacerbated, we think, by today's leaders being increasingly distracted by 24/7 media pressures, by election timetables, and this increasing urgency of now. Many sort of politicians have sort of said in confidence, we know what we need to do, but we don't know how to get re-elected if we do it. So in democracies, there seems to be a sort of clear tension between the capacity of governments to deliver long-term solutions in the collective interests and the more short-term political demands. And, in the report, this issue is not unique to the political sphere. Corporates are also increasingly short-term at the cost of longer-term strategic decision-making. Quarterly earning targets, hyper-speed trading systems, impatient stakeholders, performance bonuses are often reinforcing a short-termism, and this is something that Dominic Barton and Andy Haldane and others have given extensive thought to, and we were very honoured to talk with them as part of the Commission process. I think the other thing that is changing, that has made, that's making change so hard, is also this lack of political engagement and public trust. There are, seem to be more limited opportunities for constructive engagement, and there's declining trust in politics and institutions, which undermines citizens' involvement. We seem to be reaching the end of an era of tight affiliations to political parties. This slide shows the dramatic decline in political party membership in the UK, with young people particularly disillusioned with politics and politics as usual. And there's a sort of perception gap between those in power and the broader citizenry seems to be growing. This is, obviously an example of the UK, but I think it's quite there's quite a similar story to be told in many countries around the world, particularly in advanced economies. At the same time, we're seeing a decline in newspaper readership, increasing paywalls online to newspaper content, reduced numbers of trained journalists who have typically served as important gaps on governments. So we need to sort of understand what all of these changes mean for generating pressure for change in many of these areas that we consider to be so important. That said, in the report we do try to say that we just try to sort of understand some of the more positive shifts that are also occurring. So there are clearly more new online tools and methods of participation that are potentially widening opportunities for discussion and debate. And there's some encouragement perhaps to be found in the way single-issue campaigns are thriving in today's political landscapes. So from mass protests on the treatment of women in India, or protests against Starbucks for tax avoidance, which was sort of organised online, or bottom-up campaigns to keep a female face on British currency. These sort of single-issue groups have proven sort of very highly effective at blocking particular policies or drawing attention to inaction or damaging, drawing attention to inaction or perhaps damaging company behaviour or what it might be. So I think, whilst this sort of growing number of single-issue campaigns continues to grow, it will be important to sort of assess what that sort of change means. And in the report, we give some thought to this, that people often sort of lend their support to something by, clicking online or supporting a petition or whatever it might be. But that's quite different to sort of standing out there in the snow and protesting, or, so the way people are engaging with politics is also changing. We need to sort of try and understand that. The fourth sort of factor that we looked at in terms of why things are increasingly hard is also the growing complexity of the issues that we're trying to think about, that we're trying to address. All of those trends and challenges that I outlined at the beginning are all incredibly interconnected and interdependent. So you can't address the food challenge issue without thinking about challenges of urbanisation or growing middle class. They're all increasingly complex, and also the speed, the scale and the spread of the issues compounds the challenge of physically getting things done. In many of these cases, the evidence base can be uncertain, and so that can often undermine capacity to get things done, whilst an emphasis on consensus can also undermine our collective abilities to act. And then the final sort of shaping factor that makes change so difficult that we thought about in this section of the report was also cultural biases, that globalisation seems to have amplified cultural differences, but also we still have excluded key voices. So there are entrenched barriers that shut out many women and young people out of critical conversations and activities, and cultural differences still provide a barrier to change. And many thought globalisation would bring us closer together, but in many ways it's entrenched local positions, and this is something that certainly Pascal Lamy was very concerned about in terms of how we can build a sort of greater understanding of the different perspectives that people bring to the table in terms of global governance, or in terms of global challenges, to be able to address them. So we now come to having sort of tried to digest all of that, all of these ingredients, why things are getting harder. The Commission tried to think about, well, what can be done? What are the sort of practical recommendations that should be taken on specific challenges? And we also provided some recommendations which seek to overcome the sort of cultural or ideological barriers to this sort of longer term view. So these were, we framed our sort of 15 recommendations at the end of the report around these sorts of, these 5 broad principles. And, there are principles around, we wanted to try and look beyond, we didn't want to create yet another report that tries to go into great depth about how we needed to reform the UN or global governance. There are hundreds of reports that try to tackle global governance challenges. We wanted to try and come up with some practical things that could happen sooner rather than later to try and get change. So that either worked with existing institutions or tried to build on existing ideas, as well as some new ones. But the broad themes of our recommendations are around creative coalitions, innovative, open and reinvigorated institutions that might perhaps be separate but accountable from the Parliament or whatever it might be, to try and take that sort of longer term view and make sure that that information was feeding back into governments and policy making, decision making. We worried about revaluing the future. With Nick Stern as one of our commissioners, we spent quite a lot of time thinking about discounting and how the way different governments use discounting reflects their value on the future, and how we needed we couldn't come up with one single discount rate, and I won't bore you all with discount rate talks tonight, but it was certainly something that we felt was important in terms of how governments and others think about the future. And clearly also around younger generations, that particularly with the youth employment crisis and other things, that this was really about how do we, this is a commission for future generations, but it's also about current generations, because many of younger generations are going to have to deal with many of the issues that we're talking about. And then the sort of final broad theme of the recommendations was around this establishing a common platform of understanding, which was Pascal's particular passion, which was perhaps a little, we could be accused of being a little bit ideological, but it was, that we needed to have a shared base from which humanity could agree a shared vision, and that the way that current structures and processes is developed isn't a shared, doesn't come from the same perspectives, and that we needed to have, as difficult as it might sound and as difficult as it may be in practice to achieve, we needed to, try to move away from what is perceived to be a very Western-based values approach to these challenges and come to a much more common understanding and shared view about what we wanted to achieve and what the sort of planet we wanted to leave for our future generations. But I wanted to talk through just a couple of our recommendations in more detail, and perhaps the ones that I'm talking about tonight are the ones that have also got the most traction since we launched the report in October of last year. And I just took advantage of a Canadian-themed leaf here for this one, but essentially this idea is around a coalition of the working to counteract climate change. We argue in the report that the fight against climate change requires renewed vigour, and that this coalition would aim to kickstart the process as a building block to the UNFCCC meeting in Paris in 2015, bringing together, we call it C20, C30, C40, C20 being 20 countries, C30 being 30 companies, and C40 being 40 cities, to undertake practical, meaningful action on climate change. The idea behind this creative coalition is that you don't need every country around the table to agree before you can move forward. That you can take, it might not be 20, but it might take some countries, perhaps the biggest emitters, the biggest emitting companies, and the most active cities to try and get progress on this. And I am really pleased to say that with this particular initiative, we also haven't tried to start from scratch. We've been working with the existing C40, the coalition that already exists on cities, so that's already in existence, and with the World Business Council of Sustainable Development. So we've got the C30 and the C40 all sort of signed up to help create this coalition and try to work, and we're now looking to work out how we get the 20 countries on board. I was hoping CG, with their experience with the G20, might be able to help us with this particular part of the jigsaw. But even so, just having the two coalition partners in place already, we're really looking to move forward with this particular recommendation. Another one of our key recommendations is called Fit Cities, which is a network to fight non-communicable diseases. It's a collaboration of food, beverage, alcohol providers with public health and city authorities to reduce the burden of NCDs on health systems. Peter Piot, who's one of the former head of UNAIDS, a leading health expert in the UK, was one of our commissioners, and he's leading our work now and trying to take forward the Fit Cities initiative. But essentially, we're envisaging a network of mega cities, both developing and developed countries, that sort of look at questions of the availability of healthy food, the quality of health education, and sort of what are some of the effective measurements or mechanisms that can enhance healthy lifestyles in order to try and tackle the significant problem of NCDs. In cybersecurity, at the Oxford Martin School, we're very privileged to have a cybersecurity capacity building centre that was funded by the Foreign Office, and we have leading expertise there. So the recommendation around cybersecurity was the creation of this CyberX, a new early warning platform that was aimed at promoting a better understanding of common cyber threats for the shared benefit of government, corporates and individual interests. So the idea is that this sort of shared platform would share information on global cyber system weaknesses, on suspicious internet traffic or malicious software, whilst also helping some governments, perhaps less experienced governments and businesses, implement sort of minimal technical and policy standards for cybersecurity to try and help this increasing threat around cybersecurity issues. One of the other recommendations, this one was developed in discussion with Sir Tony Atkinson, who's one of the Oxford Martin School's leading academics. And this is essentially around statistics, which clearly underpin almost all government decisions and business decisions, and yet there remain legitimate questions about the rigour of the numbers in which we rely to make these really quite crucial commissions. So with the help of Tony and the other commissioners, we recommend this establishment of WorldStat, a specialist agency charged with undertaking quality control of global statistics, of assessing domestic practices, regulating misuse, and also improving data collection. And we're actually having a meeting in late May in Oxford, of many leading statisticians from the OECD and the World Bank and elsewhere, trying to think about this idea in more detail. Because I should say that of all the recommendations that we have in the report, we're not wedded to the way that they're described in the report. Naturally, we put them out there as starting ideas, but we really want others to talk to us about how they might be improved, how we can take them forward, and we're not sort of wedded to the exact description that we have, but these are starting points for conversations. And then the final recommendation that I thought might be interesting to talk about today, that certainly sparked up a bit of interest, is around these sunset clauses for international institutions. So whilst we didn't want to have too many recommendations on global governance, we felt we needed to have something, so we went with something quite controversial for our friends in Geneva and elsewhere. And this really comes about because, since the establishment of the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions over 60 years ago, the number of international agencies has significantly grown, with the sort of spaghetti bowl of overlapping mandates. The UN itself has over 20 different agencies, and whilst mandates have changed and sprawled in different directions, not one agency has been closed down in that whole time. And so we're not saying that they all need to be shut down, but we do think that it's important to embed within the structures mechanisms to enable review of accomplishments and mandates to ensure that they are suited to 21st century purposes and perhaps not 20th century purposes from when they were created. So we're recommending the building of, putting sunset clauses into the frameworks of all of these publicly funded international institutions so that you can embed this process of review and renewal within their mandates. So that's just some of our 15 recommendations. I hope that you're inspired to pick up the report and read the rest of them. As I said, we have been fortunate in our chair that Pascal and the commissioners have always been very determined that this report would not join that sort of long list of well-meaning, well-intended reports of this nature that sort of die in the sort of desk drawer of well-intended reports, or they sort of collect lots of dust on shelves. And we've always been very confident or determined from the beginning that once the producing a report was the first stage, and that it was in the dissemination and the discussions and the implementation where this commission, if it is to have any impact, is to have its impact. So we are now, as I mentioned, with some of those recommendations, doing specific things to move them forward. We're also having, an extensive dissemination campaign. So we were kind of fortunate that Pascal's time as the head of the WTO finished just before we launched the report. And we're proud to have him working quite hard for us, going all around the world, talking about this report and talking to people about how we might be able to take forward some of these ideas. And it's a great honour to be here today to talk to you guys about some of our ideas, and I'm really looking forward to sort of hearing what you think of what we've said and how we might be able to take some of these ideas forward or improve them and so on. I mean, one of the things we wanted to be sure about in the Commission was that we don't want to be all sort of doom and gloom. There is much to celebrate from the past decades. on balance, the world is much safer, it's healthier, it's more productive, and it's more cooperative than ever. But there is a lot more to be done, and we hope that our report helps to kick off some progress in some of these areas where action is so desperately needed. So thank you again to CG and to David and to Fred and to the team for having me for this presentation, and I look forward to some questions. Thank you. So I think people go to microphones if they have any questions. I think the way it works here is that we take one from each side and potentially from online. So
Okay.
perhaps if we start, is there?
Okay. So my name is Robert Milligan, and I'm a local citizen, very much involved in local politics, the environment, the future of the world, and so on. So my question is this, and then I'll qualify it. Wouldn't you consider that inadequate education of the citizens of the world is a major cause of blockage? And I particularly apply this to the more powerful and wealthy whose inadequate education. When I say inadequate, I mean they don't have this integrated, holistic type of education necessary for them to better understand all these interrelated problems that you're dealing with. So they can't define problems adequately. They can't come up with solutions adequately. I mean, you have to define the problem well first before you can come up with a good solution. And so all these people fall back on political ideologies as a source of interpretation of the problems and to make up for the educational inadequacy. If they were better educated, most of these ideologies would be thrown out because of their gross inadequacies, and they lead to all sorts of unnecessary conflicts in the world. And I include religious ideologies too. So.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so thank you for that. And certainly education and the need for more awareness and understanding of all of these issues was something that the commissioners were very concerned about. But I guess we didn't want to sort of have a recommendation that was sort of simply that we need more education on all these areas. But we do acknowledge in the report that education is obviously a critical thing, and we also acknowledge the significant improvements that have occurred in terms of empowerment through education. So there are, I can't remember, there's a lot of statistics in the report, so I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but the numbers in terms of the number of people in primary school and secondary school and other improvements are cause for celebration. And also the increasing availability of online education and other things as being, a very positive thing.
Just along those lines, your institution could initiate types of integrated knowledge courses through the online dimension 3 that would be free and so on. I mean, after all, MIT and Harvard are offering many of their courses free. You could develop courses because institutions resist these types of courses. Most professors do not want to see this type of knowledge because they would have to integrate their discipline into it, and they don't feel up to the task, many of them, particularly older ones. And I'm 74 myself.
That's a good suggestion. I'll certainly take it back to Oxford. I mean, one of the, I think where we do add value is that we are funding, genuinely interdisciplinary research on these challenges. Whilst there's a lot of sort of hype and promotion of interdisciplinarity in universities, often it doesn't sort of live up to the lip service that's being provided. And, we're really trying to provide opportunities for mathematicians and physicists and biologists and ethicists and philosophers to come together and really think about these big issues and think about them in an interconnected way. And whilst we don't yet offer online training, it's certainly something we could consider in the future, but in the meantime we do spend quite a lot of effort a bit like CG in terms of having events and other opportunities to hear these sort of different interdisciplinary perspectives on some of the big global challenges and trying to sort of have a real sort of public engagement around some of those questions. Perhaps over from this side now.
My name is Akram. I'm for my S. I wonder if you could tell us the regional conflict for the last century until now. It doesn't seem to subside or to be stopped. So what the future of this conflict going to be in any regional of those globally regions? Say wars, for instance.
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite understood the question there. It was around regional conflicts and how we were going to...
Is the conflicts increasing or decreasing in this present time? If it's increase, what's the future of all these?
Sure.
We have to face it. Yeah. And as a result of this conflict, there is hunger, there is poverty, there is diseases. So all these conflicts, it doesn't seem to subsidize for the last even 10 years until now. Thank you.
Thank you. We do talk a little bit about conflict in the report, and there we do acknowledge that conflict certainly hasn't gone away. There are still a number of significant regional conflicts, and I guess part of what we're trying to do in the report is prevent future conflicts that may actually result because of food shortages or water shortages or issues as a result of climate change. So in part of what we're trying to do is prevent future regional conflicts that might occur because of tensions around particular resource insecurities and so on. But we do also acknowledge in the report that whilst there is still much conflict and perhaps regionally based, we have prevented big-scale global wars since the Second World War. That's not happened again. And perhaps when we were thinking about the lessons of learning from previous successes, if not that you call it a success, but we have learnt from the previous large-scale wars, the great wars of the great powers, enough that we've, at this stage at least, touch wood, been able to prevent, and it looks like continue to prevent any great wars going forward. But I accept that regional conflicts remain a significant challenge.
Alice, from here at the Balsillie School and with the Academic Council on the UN. When you looked at things that had worked, I wonder if you looked at some of the international coalitions that had worked, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, the Campaign for an International Criminal Court, or the effort to the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty with Responsibility to Protect, which they've all got limits, but they've all had some fairly significant successes. So, did you look at those kind of things to see what had worked? And attached to that, in all three of those cases, there were some states that were more amenable, if you want, more interested in cooperating with each other, and some states that were largely obstructive. In fact, fairly consistently obstructive in all three of those. So the pokey question at the end of that is, if you're looking for those C20, you've got the C30, you've got the C40, Business Council and businesses and cities. Are there some countries that the Commission felt were best avoided, and some that could be seen as valuable potential allies as being more progressive in trying to put these big ideas into practice?
Thank you for that. In terms of some of those examples that you use, like the landmines case and others, I think we use all three of those in the report. I'd have to double check, but we certainly did try to look at examples where international agencies or decision-making structures were successful, and trying particularly around landmines and other things, and trying to learn, also around human rights, around criminal courts. We looked at sort of Yugoslavia and Rwanda and other cases to try and learn from those examples. So we draw from a really broad range of of examples, including those. And I hope that you agree with perhaps our analysis in the report when you get hold of it. In terms of the more difficult question, yes, I mean, we obviously tried to be quite diplomatic in the way, we're thinking about these coalitions, but we naturally want parties and countries and players that actually want to play by the rules and take meaningful action. So when we, particularly on the Creative Coalition, for example, we spent a lot of time wondering how we can avoid the sort of free rider problem of countries or places just sort of signing up and saying that they're part of it, but actually either, deliberately not doing anything or undermining efforts to actually get anything done. And so we haven't quite sort of cracked it, but one of the things we're thinking about in that coalition is what does it mean to be a member of that, and how can you enforce action? So how can you measure whether things have actually been done that say they're going to do, and what will be the implications if they don't do so? And so that's certainly been, and we've been trying to sort of think about how best to do that. That's not that doesn't dissuade countries or people from coming on board. So we're thinking about that. We have an online question, which is asking about how the report's application at the local level, so how can community level groups contribute, and that's from Brenda in Cambridge. I've never had an online question before, so this is very exciting for me. Well, Brenda, no. I just sort of felt like a radio commentator for a moment there. This is a really good question, and one that we've had a lot of interest in terms of local communities wanting to get engaged in the Commission themes, and that's something that we've been really enthused by. So getting emails and responses all over the world, people wanting to be engaged in the Commission or contribute. I have to say, at this point, we're still trying to figure out the best way of really harnessing the genuine interest that the Commission seems to be generating. At a sort of very basic level, I'd encourage Brenda and anybody to sort of sign up to our to the Oxford Martin School website, where we're constantly promoting the various Commission activities that are happening. So there have been, as I said, a lot of events all over the world where we've been talking about the sort of Commission themes and sort of trying to promote them. But we're also really trying to get an online discussion going around the themes of the Commission. So if you were to go to the Commission website on the Oxford Martin School's homepage, that's why I sort of was promoting the hashtag long term now. We have a lot of sort of discussion, and we're asking people to write blogs or pieces on the website where they can sort of tell us their views on particular aspects of the report or ways that things might be taken forward, and we're very keen for that conversation and discussion to continue online. But we're also interested in how else community groups might like to be involved, because we're all open to suggestions on that.
Hi. I very much appreciate your presentation. It was excellent. Very positive. I have one question for you. What do you think the elites of the world think of your program?
Think of what, sorry?
Of your program and what you're doing.
Well, I think that the report has been fairly well received by many many elite, as you might call them, and on our webpage we have a number of endorsements by very sort of eminent people, including sort of Ban Ki-moon and Al Gore and Andy Haldane and a whole range of other people who have sort of really welcomed the report and welcomed the succinct way that it's tried to capture all of these challenges and issues, but then also try to provide some practical ideas on how to take it forward. So I think we're still continuing in terms of trying to use the extensive networks of our commissioners to promote the findings to very senior decision makers and other elite individuals, as you refer to them. But so far it's been received well, but the proof will be in the pudding, won't it? It'll be whether we're able to actually get many of these very influential people and others to implement some of these ideas and to drive change. So perhaps ask me that again in 6 months or a year.
Barry Karen from CG. As you know, the Australians are chairing the G20 this year. Presume Tony Abbott has read your report. Light bulb goes on, and he calls you up and says, look, I'm really keen on the sunset clause business. Tell me more. I'm really interested in doing something about short-termism. What should we do about it?
As an Australian, I certainly hope that Tony Abbott has read the report extensively and drawn significant knowledge and inspiration from it. Although, I guess we haven't been that confident in the role of the G20 under the current Australian government's leadership, but that's perhaps a conversation for another day. In terms of if he had accepted the report and was inspired by all of these things, what do we think he should do about short-termism? I think that's kind of what you're asking, Barry, is that right? I guess what we're arguing is the need for governments and others to really try and embed the capacity for longer-term analysis and information to really feed directly into policy decision-making processes, and also the sort of political conversations that are having within national and global context, so that it's not increasingly driven by the sort of politics of the day. So I'd be looking for Tony Abbott or any other leader to sort of pick up the report and sort of draw inspiration from it in order to try and re-engage people on issues beyond the electoral cycle and these sort of longer-term perspectives that are actually genuinely difficult for governments and others to have those conversations when there are obviously, pressing pressures on their time and other sort of more immediate demands. So I'd be looking for Tony to become a more inspirational and provide a sort of longer-term narrative and vision. But we'd also be looking for him or other governments to try and think about the systems and structures that do exist, so that we don't always have to wait for crisis for things to happen, so that we can build more resilient, more inclusive societies, more systems that enable, no matter what the sort of major trend or issue might be, that we do have systems in place that enable us to deal with these sort of longer term issues, and also break down the silos in many of our sort of government approaches, so that we are able to more clearly identify the connections between some of these challenges and drive, innovative policy changes that are so desperately needed. I hope Tony's listening.
Okay, Bashir Habib from Kitchener-Waterloo. I'm involved in a number of capacity development projects, both locally here and internationally. So, first of all, just a fascinating presentation. I take my hat off for the team for reaching out and thinking about the future, which a lot of people don't do that. So, just following from that, the question is, who is going to make these changes, and how are we going to make the changes? So it's a question of implementation. There were a lot of things that you had said, but the one thing that really intrigued me was, you talked about current institutions, which are not, the institutions that we have are yesterday's institutions, are probably not ready or probably have to be ready to take the challenges in the future. So following from that, the question is on leadership. Did you talk about leadership? Did you discuss leadership in terms of what needs to change from a leadership point of view in a global leadership? And I'm talking about a collective leadership rather than a single individual who is going to take on this task to make these changes. What are some of the changes that you would like to see happen to the leadership? What sort of characteristics or what sort of mindsets do we need in order to address the changes that you've talked about? And then a sub-question to that is that, do we have any role models of any governments or any countries right now that are addressing these challenges probably better than many other countries. Would be interesting to know what can we learn from these countries as we adapt to the challenges that you've talked about.
Okay, two pretty tricky questions there. I mean, in terms of leadership, yes, it is something that we thought about in the report. And we, particularly in the section B, where we did look at the role of leadership in terms of being able to drive change. So I mentioned Jacques Delors in his sort of determination on the European single market program, something that Pascal also worked very closely with him on. So we were able to sort of draw on his insights there. But that role of Delors in that example as a sort of leader that really, if it hadn't been for him, it perhaps wouldn't have happened. And similarly, the leadership of the WHO on the tobacco reform was another sort of area that we looked at. In terms of recommendations for leaders today or how to improve leadership, I mean, we deliberately didn't have a recommendation which was we need better leaders. We really didn't want to sort of go down that path, which many of these sorts of reports do. But we wanted to try and look at some of the factors in place that do make leadership difficult. And that's where we talked about the sort of shaping factors around sort of time pressures and outdated institutions and structures around leaders, but also things like vested interests, which really do deliberately make it very, very difficult for leaders to get things done and to legitimately get re-elected. I mean, we have some numbers in the report about leaders in the EU and just the sheer turnover of leaders in the last 5 years or so because of the crisis. Now, were they worse or better leaders than the leaders of those countries prior to them, or were they a sort of product of circumstance that meant that it was going to be very difficult for them to be re-elected given the circumstances? I mean, there's some of the things that we tried to grapple with, but we do want to also acknowledge that it's genuinely hard to be a leader today. And so we tried to think about what are some of those things that make that so difficult to be able to enable them to become more influential and more proactive leaders on many of these issues. But obviously more can still be done. In terms of governments that are doing this well or that are grappling with all of these issues well, and that's a very difficult answer. Many countries have varying successes on varying challenges, so it's difficult to say which one is doing well on all of these things. But what we did try to do in the report was try and look at the way different countries use different structures or systems to think about longer-term challenges and issues. Not necessarily, we don't make any judgments, we don't say which ones are necessarily good or bad, and we also drew from a very global commission to think about this. But we looked at systems in place in China, for example, around their medium to long-term planning, which does require a very concerted and combined effort to look at the sort of longer-term vision of the country. And as part of that, I mean, climate change has been something that the Chinese government have made significant commitments on and made significant progress on, and it's partly because of their sort of longer-term planning structures that have enabled them to do that. And they also don't have the challenge of democracy, which can make that a little bit easier as well. But we look at sort of national planning commissions and other institutional frameworks that might help. And we, as is often the case, we turn to the Nordic states and look at what they're doing. And we look at the example of Finland, which possibly has one of the more effective mechanisms in place, which is this, I think it's called the Council for the Future. It's a cross-parliamentary committee of different MPs and experts, which look in detail at particular long-term issues, and then that's fed back into the decision-making process. But it seems to be quite an effective way of getting cross-party ownership and consensus on many of these issues. And that's also something we think about in the report around how you could set up independent but accountable institutions that have cross-party support so that you can sort of try and take away the politics. Well, appreciating that's often very difficult on many of these challenges, but trying to take away the politics in terms of the analysis and reflection on these issues. So. Commissioner.
Well, welcome to Waterloo. You know, as citizens, we're really honored to have CG in our community and happy to have you here. You talked a lot about institutions that were outdated, but you didn't really dwell on the new institutions that seem to be brand new, that are global in size, that are very rich, very influential, wield great power, and yet seem to be apolitical. And I'm talking about the new institutions like Google and Facebook and others that are rising and their role in our future.
No, you're absolutely right. I didn't reflect in detail on those sort of more newer institutions that are obviously increasingly shaping our world and the way we sort of think about information and gather material. I mean, we do think about this a little bit in the report in terms of, particularly in section B, around how politics is changing, about how we get our information, what are our sort of trusted sources, and what does that mean. So in terms of, you know, with the decline of newspapers, there's also the increase in blogs and people that are sort of joining online communities in their areas of interest, and whether these are sort of sources of good or sources of distraction in terms of are we getting more sort of information about these things, but we're not more knowledgeable about these things. So we do sort of think a little bit about these sorts of trends. And I guess also in our analysis of corporations that it's, you know, and we're not just talking about sort of big oil firms or climate pollutants. It is the sort of, you know, whether you're Google or Amazon or whatever, this sort of corporate responsibility to leave the world in a better place. And that's why we do try to have some recommendations there around the sort of role of corporates to not only, you know, reduce the short-termism within their sort of corporate structures, but also be thinking about their responsibilities in this piece of the puzzle. But I agree that perhaps more could be done.
Me again. Another quick question for you. To what extent did the work of the Commission or your work now, you know, post-report, fit in with the UN's post-2015 development planning? Because this is, you mentioned the MDGs up there, but I'm sure you know there's enormous global discussions going on now. The high-level panel report was issued, and September next year, the General Assembly should be meeting to agree on the post-2015 development agenda. So where does the Commission's report and its recommendations, if you want, fit? Does it fit inside that? Does it run parallel to it? What would the relationship be between the two? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, we were aware that the Commission's report was sort of happening alongside all of these sort of significant global discussions around the Sustainable Development Goals or the post-MDGs. We haven't been as explicitly involved in those discussions. We do mention, you know, the important work that's going on and the various subcommittees that are doing some thinking on that. And in our report, we try to, I guess our contribution there is trying to draw out what are some of the things from the MDGs that are perhaps sort of useful to be thinking about as they enter their next stage. So we try to acknowledge that there are some tensions that came about by the way that the MDGs were decided and the sort of lack of consultation that occurred. But we try to reinforce in the report, and we've, you know, tried to do that in conversations post delivering the report, about where the MDGs have proven successful in terms of being, you know, very clear, concise, and tangible goals. So trying to sort of ensure that the next stage in the process does continue to try and keep those characteristics of being succinct and very sort of clear, comprehensive goals in those sort of critical areas. So that's kind of been the Commission's contribution to that specific debate, and we haven't, you know, perhaps that's something we could do some more work in terms of trying to get involved in these later stages. But I should say within the Oxford Martin School research teams, we do have a program on human rights for future generations, which brings together political scientists and philosophers and international lawyers. And they are doing quite a bit of work on thinking about the post MDGs and how, and the sort of human rights component, and how you sort of do, to try and ensure sort of greater ownership and representation in the sort of next stage of those goals. So indirectly through the Oxford Martin School research, we are very actively engaged in those debates. Great.
My name is Sarah Engel. I'm a local high school student here in Waterloo. And I recall you speaking briefly about the sort of disconnect which has occurred between youth and politics with respect to a decline in party membership. So my question was along the lines of, in the process of developing the report that came to being through the Commission, were there any youth consulted on the strategies which would be determined as good for the continuation of helping youth be engaged in that to solve that sort of disconnect that which has occurred?
Sure, it's an excellent question, and I think if you look at the list of the great and good, you might notice that not many of them are that young, although they might argue with me on that point. So it was a sort of a challenge for us in terms of the Commission, in that, they wanted people with, they'd say scars on their back, people that had a significant experience. But one of the great concerns, particularly as the Secretariat, was making sure that, young people were consulted and considered in the deliberations and how we went about doing the Commission report. So in that regard, throughout the process, we had a number of sessions with younger generations. So we had a big sort of session with all these scholars in Cambridge of younger people, and we also did stuff with the WEF's World, like Young Global Shapers and Young Global Leaders, amongst sort of other activities where we tried to get sort of various students and things together to help influence the report. But I think, perhaps more could have been done. We also tried to get a lot more sort of youth engagement on the online activities and discussions that we had for the report. But it was, something that we were very keen on, and we did sort of test out the ideas with a number of, students and others in terms of specific recommendations that were directed at youth. But we certainly welcome further ideas about how, younger people feel about this sort of perceived increasing disconnection with politics and how that might be reversed.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. It's been fantastic.
Well, a few comments before we adjourn. First of all, I'd like to thank Natalie Day for her presentation here this evening of the work of the Oxford Martin Commission. Natalie showed us various futures, the future we don't want but will have if we continue to have short-term thinking, and the future we prefer, which will require more global coalitions and more long-term policy planning. That's going to take considerable effort. The Oxford Martin Commission's work deserves further attention, and Natalie, for coming here. She actually traveled from England yesterday during one of the harsher days of what has been a particularly tough winter, so it's a good demonstration of the kind of sturdiness and persistence it's going to take to drive these ideas forward, and for that and for coming to Waterloo, we thank you very much. The edited video of this evening's live webcast will be posted to our website, and we'll also post a blog there, so if you'd like to comment further on these ideas, you can add your own thoughts. Our next public events in the CG Auditorium are coming up quickly. On Tuesday, March 18th, we welcome Omar Samad, former ambassador of Afghanistan to Canada and a senior Central Asia fellow at the New America Foundation, talking about the future of Afghanistan after 2014 when the Western militaries pull out. The following Tuesday, March 25th, British economist Margaret S. Macmillan of Tufts University will illustrate how recent labour and governance data could be signals of a quiet revolution that is modernizing Africa. And then on Wednesday, April 2nd, Jed Davis, the Executive Chair of Scenarios at the World Energy Council, will review the main findings of the Global Energy Assessment and the consequences for developing countries and the rest of the world. So be sure to register for our events newsletter to get information on these and other upcoming events and our CG Cinema series. Thank you again for coming tonight, and have a safe journey home.
That very kind introduction, and it's great to be here in Waterloo to talk to you tonight about the Now for the Long Term, the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations. Unfortunately, we did have a bit of a hiccup with the delivery of the reports today, which we did hope to be able to disseminate, but unfortunately, perhaps due to weather and some other DHL complications that we could be the subject of a whole other lecture. We don't actually have the reports this evening, but they will be available here at CG, I'm told, and you can also download the report from the Oxford Martin School website, which will provide the website. Hopefully this talk will inspire you to go and download the report, and perhaps it'll be a test of how interested you are in the report, those of you that come back to actually physically get it. And I'll also be looking at the download figures from Waterloo post this to see how many of you have followed up. So sorry that the report is not here. But firstly, I wanted to give you a bit of background of the Oxford Martin School, which is obviously where we decided to establish the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations. We were set up by this guy, James Martin, who very generously gave $100 million to Oxford University, and then another $50 million if it could be matched, to set up the Oxford Martin School. And essentially we fund interdisciplinary research into 21st century global challenges. And we now fund over 35 different programs and institutions across the university that are all doing interdisciplinary research on longer term issues. And to be funded by us, it has to be interdisciplinary, you have to be in Oxford, you have to be working on a challenge of a global dimension of a longer term nature, and you have to have an impact beyond academia, which is why my role as head of policy is so important in terms of trying to connect the academic research to governments and policymakers. So much of what, it's a delight to be here today to talk about the work of the Commission. Much of it was inspired by the research that's happening at the Oxford Martin School. And our research there ranges from all the sort of nasty challenges that are out there, but also some opportunities in terms of, ageing population and economic growth and so on. But we also fund things like geoengineering and food security, ethics in war, future of humanity, all sorts of things. Responsible for the unique identification project there. Also representatives from Brazil and Singapore. Sadly, no Canadians, but I'm sure in the next commission we'll be sure to address that. There's also no Australians either, so we're all in the dark here. But so this was a sort of group of people that all came together and all agreed that this was something that they wanted to try and provide some fresh thinking on. And my own role, behind every great and good commission, there's obviously a great and good secretariat. We were just a small secretariat, which I was very honoured to lead. And so we worked very closely with Pascal and these commissioners over just 12 months to produce the elusive report that you haven't got in front of you. So the Commission's aims, as Fred mentioned, we tried to outline an agenda for the long term, and we wanted to draw attention to this increasing short-termism of modern politics and our collective inability to break this gridlock that undermines efforts to address, the biggest challenges of today. And, we have really been overwhelmed by the response to the report. We've had over 780,000 downloads in 160 countries, which is quite, impressive number, we think, after just launching the report in October last year. And tonight, I'm just going to talk you through the Commission report in three parts of the Commission's work, and then we can, as Fred said, have some more time for questions and answers. But our case for action was really built in three parts. Part A which Pascal often described as sort of the easy part, which was trying to capture what are these major trends and challenges that are likely to shape the next century. So what should we be thinking about? What should we be worrying about? The second part, where we hope the Commission report has genuinely added something new to these discussions and debates, because there are a lot of reports on major trends and challenges, is where we try to learn from previous examples of success and failure in addressing global challenges. You know, what worked, what didn't work, and also what are some of the factors today that make change so difficult for decision makers and politicians and so on. And then obviously the final part is the juicy part.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CG as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CG. I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the Signature Lecture Series. Thanks also to those joining us from around the world through our live webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience, the live audience here at the microphones on either side, or if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the chat function on your screen, and those will be transmitted to our speaker here. Please remember to state your name at that time and keep your questions brief. Now, anyone who's taken a boat out on even the calmest waters knows the difference between rowing and steering. Steering brings to mind words such as vision, direction, and stability. And this metaphor is one of the metaphors used in the Oxford Martin Commission report for future generations. It's called Now for the Long Term. The Oxford Martin School established this commission to consider how governments and global institutions can look beyond the pressures of short-term crises and plan for the long term. Our guest this evening will explain the importance of the commission's work and the need for governments to do less rowing and more steering, with more of an eye on the distant horizon. Natalie Day is Head of Policy at the Oxford Martin School and led the Commission's Secretariat. She's responsible for establishing it as a leading source of policy-relevant research on global challenges and opportunities. Natalie was previously a senior researcher at the UK think tank Demos, specializing in global innovation policy. In a recent column in The Guardian, Natalie described the Commission's report as the beginning of a conversation to shift perspectives towards the longer term. We're pleased that Natalie has chosen to further that conversation with a public audience here at CG in Waterloo. So please join me now in welcoming our distinguished guest, Natalie Day.
Great. Thank you, Fred, for... So if you've got some burning questions about any sort of 21st century challenges, you might also want to look into them to the Martin School. But when we were looking across these 35 programs and institutions, we wanted to sort of think about what was it that connected geoengineering to food security, to our climate program, to our ageing population program. What were some of the unifying issues that all of these different research groups in Oxford were facing? And we ultimately decided that it was, you know, it was a increasing concern amongst our academics about increasing short-termism within governments and policymakers, that it was increasingly difficult to get leading figures to think beyond the electoral cycle. And also a frustration with what was perceived to be a growing gridlock in many of these challenges where action is so important. And we actually know quite a lot about many of the big issues that we're facing today, and yet being able to bridge this gap between knowledge and action we found increasingly hard. So in order to try and provide some fresh thinking on these sort of critical questions, we set up the Oxford Martin Commission, and who better to lead this, we thought, than Pascal Lamy, who himself was clearly dealing with a little bit of gridlock in him trying to get through the Doha trade round at the WTO. And so when we approached Pascal to see if he would join us to lead or chair this commission, we were very delighted that he jumped on the opportunity because for those that sort of follow Pascal's work, he's one of the sort of great intellectual thinkers on global governance reform and many of these issues, and was very, very passionate about how we might be able to provide some fresh ideas to break the gridlock on global challenges. And so with Pascal's assistance, we pulled together this list of commissioners, this sort of dauntingly impressive list of great and good that came from all over the world, and all of them, with significant experience and expertise in leading governments or global governance organisations or businesses, and all of them. It's a very global commission. So we had Minister Liu He, a very senior minister in China, Nandan Nilekani, who's a minister in India, who's the recommendations, where we try to provide a combination of practical ideas to break the gridlock on some of the challenges, but also some more principle-based ideas to try and embed the longer term in decision-making structures. So I'll just talk you through some of the quick findings. I mean, here, this slide just captures the 8 megatrends, or 7 megatrends, I should say, that the report looked at. So many of these are arising from globalisation, which are reinforcing old, but also generating new sets of challenges. Around demographics in terms of large and ageing populations, around mobility in terms of urbanisation and an expanding middle class, in society around increasing inequality and unemployment, in geopolitics, in power transitions and cybersecurity challenges, in sustainability around resource insecurity, and health around the shifting burdens of disease, and technology around the sort of information and communications revolutions and what those sorts of things mean. Many of the trends that we talk about are well known, so I'm not going to sort of dwell on them in too much detail, but I thought it was perhaps useful just to share some of the trends and challenges that we'll face, that will shape the sort of next decade or more, so that you know, just to put the report in a bit more context before getting into the second and third section. In terms of demographics, as you will be well aware, we are seeing a huge shift in demographics. Over 60% of the population is likely to live in Africa and Asia by 2050. Approximately 70% of growth is likely to occur in 24 of the world's poorest countries. Population is getting older. In less than 40 years, 1 in 5 people will be over 60 years old. In terms of mobility, when you look at challenges like urbanisation in the 1950s, only 3 in 10 people lived in cities. And in 2008, the number of people living in cities is greater than rural areas for the first time. This slide shows the rise of the middle class, also another huge phenomenon that many commentators have written significantly about. And it shows the prediction of middle class populations in 2030, which is the blue circle, compared to 2009. So the extraordinary growth in middle class is both a fantastic opportunity